St. Patrick warned us about this, and nobody in church will tell you Patrick wrote 2 documents in his entire life that survived. 2, out of everything, 40 years of letters, of correspondence with bishops in Britain and Gaul, of pastoral instruction to communities spread across the north and west of Ireland. 2 things made it through the centuries intact. The Confessio, you've probably heard of. The other one almost nobody talks about, including almost every church that celebrates him every March. The second document is a letter. It was written in a rage that Patrick almost doesn't try to conceal. It was addressed to a man named Coroticus, a warlord, a British king, and according to Patrick, a baptized Christian. A man who showed up at the shore of Ireland the day after Patrick had baptized a group of new converts, slaughtered some of them on the beach, and took the rest in chains to sell into slavery in Scotland and among the Picts. People still in their white baptismal garments, still wet from the water. Coroticus did this, and Coroticus went to church on Sunday. That letter, the Epistola, the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, is the angriest thing Patrick ever wrote. It is also the most prophetic thing he ever wrote, and it contains a warning so specific, so aimed at the exact condition that corrupts religious institutions in every century, including this one, that I think the reason it doesn't get preached from most pulpits isn't that nobody knows about it. I think it's that the people who would have to preach it know exactly what it means, and it means something about them. We'll get to what it means. But first I need to show you who Coroticus was, because the temptation, when you hear this story, is to put him in a category that lets you off the hook. Brutal, Dark Ages warlord. Different time, different world. What does that have to do with me in Sacramento or Nashville or wherever I'm watching this? And I want to close that exit before we go any further, because Patrick himself closes it in the letter. He is not writing about the kind of evil that only exists in the past. He's describing something structural, something that recurs, something that wears a cross and quotes scripture and absolutely will not change its behavior because the institution it belongs to has decided that confronting it is too costly. Coroticus was not a pagan. That's the whole point. Patrick is explicit about this. He calls him a fellow citizen, not of Ireland, but of Rome, of the Christian world, of the shared framework of civilization and faith that was supposed to bind the Western world after Constantine. He says, "I do not say to my fellow citizens, nor to the fellow citizens of the Holy Romans, but to the fellow citizens of the demons, because of their evil works." He stripped the credential. In one sentence in the 5th century, Patrick looked at a man who had been baptized and said in writing, "Your baptism is not a shield for what you did. Your church membership does not cover this. The credential you are carrying means nothing in the face of what I watched you do to people I loved while they were still in their baptismal clothes." He then did something that almost nobody in church history does to someone with political power and institutional connections. He excommunicated him, not quietly, not after careful diplomatic process. He sent the letter to be read aloud in the communities where Coroticus had allies, in the churches where his soldiers went to worship, in the congregations that received his tithes and hosted his patronage and depended on his protection. He sent it to be read in rooms full of people who had every social and financial reason to stay loyal to Coroticus and look away from what had happened on that beach. And he told those communities, "Do not eat with these men. Do not receive gifts from them. Do not let them buy access to your table or your blessing or your silence with the coin they took from people I baptized." That is the warning, and here is why nobody will tell you in church. The warning is not about what Coroticus did specifically. The raid, the massacre, the selling of Christians into slavery, as horrific as all of that was. The warning is about the system that made it possible. The warning is about what happens when religious institutions become so dependent on powerful people, on their money, their protection, their social legitimacy. that the institution loses the capacity to speak the truth about what those people are doing. The warning is about the specific way that power over time convinces the church to let it set the terms of the conversation, to decide which sins are preachable and which are not, which accountability applies and which doesn't, which people's suffering deserves a full-throated public response, and which suffering, because it was done by someone whose name is on the building, gets handled quietly, off the record, with a pastoral conversation that produces nothing. Patrick watched the church in Britain receive his letter about Coroticus. He watched them set it down. The Confessio was written partly in response to what happened after the Epistola, because the British Church's response to Patrick's public confrontation of Coroticus was not to back him up. It was to use the moment as another opportunity to question whether this rough Latin former slave bishop had the standing to go around excommunicating powerful people and embarrassing the institution. They did not say Coroticus is wrong and we stand with Patrick's converts. They effectively said Patrick is out of line and let's discuss his qualifications again. Read that one more time. Slowly. The institution, when forced to choose between protecting its relationship with a powerful, connected, baptized predator and protecting the people that predator had victimized, chose the relationship, chose the connection, chose the standing, and then turned the situation around so that the person asking for accountability became the problem. Patrick saw it happening in real time. He was 60 years old, writing by candlelight in the north of Ireland, and what he wrote in the Confessio about that period is not the language of a man surprised by betrayal. It is the language of a man who had already processed what the institution was, had already let go of the expectation that it would behave differently, and had made a decision to keep doing the mission anyway, not because the institution backed him, but because the calling did not come from the institution, and the institution therefore could not revoke it. He writes, "I'm very much in debt to God, who gave me such grace that many people were reborn in God through me, and afterwards confirmed, and that clergy were ordained everywhere for them, for a people newly come to belief. People whom the Lord took from the ends of the earth, as he had promised long ago through his prophets." This is a man cataloging what actually happened, not what the institution recognized, not what the bishops in Britain put their seal on. What actually happened in the real world with real people, in a place the institution was not willing to go because it was too uncomfortable and too far from the centers of power and too theologically messy, and the guy doing it was too unpolished for their taste. He built it anyway, with no institutional support after the confrontation with Coroticus, with the full knowledge that the body of believers that was supposed to be his covering had made its choice. He kept going. Here's where this lands in your life, and I'm not going to be gentle about it because I don't think gentleness serves you here. Most of us were taught a version of Christian faith in which the institution and the mission are basically the same thing, where the church, meaning the building, the organization, the denomination, the leadership structure, is the vehicle, and the faith is what rides inside it. And so when the vehicle starts making troubling noises, when the institution behaves in ways that look more like Coroticus than like Patrick, we experience a particular kind of crisis that has become epidemic in American Christianity right now. The crisis of, I still believe the thing, but I no longer trust the people running the thing, and I don't know what to do with that gap. Patrick's answer to that gap is not what most people expect. He did not leave, but he also did not pretend. He did not say the institution is corrupt, so I'm done with the whole project. And he absolutely did not say the institution is imperfect, but let's focus on the positive and not cause division and trust the leadership to handle it. He did the thing that is much harder than either of those exits. He wrote the letter, he put his name on it, he sent it into the rooms where it would cost him something to have it read. And then he went back to the work, not because the institution had come around, but because the work did not belong to the institution. It belonged to the people on the beach. It belonged to the ones in the white clothes. It belonged to the Irish communities who had no one else coming for them, and who Patrick, regardless of what the bishops in Britain thought of him, had made a promise to. There are people in church leadership positions across every major city in this country, in Atlanta, in LA, in Houston, in Phoenix, who know exactly what the Epistola says. They've read it. Some of them have even taught it. And in the next breath, they get on a plane to sit at a table with the Coroticus in their particular world. The donor, the board member, the politically connected name. And they find the pastoral language that acknowledges concern without demanding change, that maintains the relationship without naming what the relationship is actually costing the people at the bottom of it. This is not new. Patrick watched it happen in the 5th century and named it with a clarity so uncomfortable that 1,500 years later, the institution still hasn't fully figured out what to do with the document. But here is the thing I actually want to leave you with, because this can't be just an indictment, because Patrick did not write the Epistola as an indictment and then go into a cave somewhere to be correctly angry in private. He wrote it and then kept building, and what he was building, what he is still building, in the sense that the tradition he seeded kept growing long after his death through the Irish monasteries and the great missionaries like Columba and Columbanus and Brigid, was an alternative form of Christian community, one that was not organized around the protection of power, one that was organized around the protection of the vulnerable, one in which the person doing the baptizing is also willing to go to the shore the next morning and account for what was done to the people he baptized. The Celtic monastic tradition that grew from Patrick's work organized itself around this principle, in a way the Roman Church structure never fully did. The abbess or abbot of a Celtic monastery was not a political figure. They were a spiritual parent. Ennamchara, soul friend, was the technical term, and it described a relationship of genuine accountability that was exactly the opposite of the patron-client dynamic that Coroticus represented. In the Celtic model, you had someone who knew everything about you, your failures, your temptations, your specific points of spiritual vulnerability, and whose job was not to protect your reputation, but to tell you the truth about your soul. The institution was not organized to protect the powerful. It was organized to form the whole. That model was always in tension with empire, always in tension with the version of Christianity that aligned itself with whoever had the military force and the tax base. Patrick died knowing that tension. He had lived in the middle of it for 40 years. And what the Epistola shows us is that he never stopped being willing to name it. Not because he hated the church, not because he was anti-institutional by temperament, but because he loved the people on the beach more than he feared the cost of the letter. The question the Epistola asks every person who claims to follow Patrick's God is not a comfortable one. It is not. Are you aware that religious institutions sometimes fail? Everybody knows that. The question is, when you saw the person in the white clothes on the shore, and you saw what Coroticus did to them, and you saw the institution calculating whether it could afford to speak, what did you do? Did you write the letter? Or did you find the pastoral language? If you've been sitting in a church that has never made you uncomfortable about power, that has never asked you to reckon with what it means to follow a God who showed up consistently on the wrong side of the credentialed and the connected, this video is an invitation. Not to leave, not to burn it down, to look for what Patrick was pointing at. The version of the faith that is organized around the beach rather than around the building. Around the ones still in their wet clothes, rather than around the ones deciding whether the letter gets read. Patrick's second document survived. Barely. For centuries it was considered of uncertain authenticity. partly because it was so uncomfortable that there was institutional incentive to question whether it was really his. But it's his. The scholarship is settled. The voice is the same voice as the Confessio, the same rough Latin, the same grief, the same refusal to soften what he sees, because someone important might not like how it sounds. He sent the letter. 15 centuries later, it's still arriving. The question is whether we're the congregation that reads it or the congregation that sets it down. If this raised something in you that you don't want to let go of, subscribe. The next video goes into the Celtic model of Anam Cara and what it looks like to build the kind of accountability community Patrick was actually trying to create. Not the institution that failed him, but the thing he was building anyway in spite of it. Hit the bell. This conversation matters. Patrick wrote the letter. He put his name on it. Then he went back to work. That, more than the shamrock or the snakes or the fire on the hill, is the life you're being invited into. Name what Coroticus is doing. Then go back to the beach. Lord of the letter that nobody wanted to read, I have to tell you something that I have been circling for a long time without saying out loud. I have been in rooms where I knew what was happening, and I chose the pastoral language. I have sat at the table and calculated the cost of the letter and decided it was too high. I've looked at the people in the white clothes, and then looked at the person with the connections, and I have, not every time, but enough times that I carry it, chosen the relationship over the beach. I am not confessing this to you because you didn't see it. You were there. I'm confessing it because Patrick wrote it down at 60 years old in the Confessio in Latin that still embarrassed him. And he did not flinch from the full account of who he had been and what it had cost him to become someone different. And I want that. I want the specific honesty that makes a person writable. Someone whose life is legible enough to carry the message to the people who need it on the other side of 15 centuries. For the person hearing this, who is sitting in the gap right now, who still believes the thing but has watched the institution make the Coroticus calculation one too many times, meet them in the gap. Not with an easy answer. With the honest presence of a God who has been watching institutions make that calculation since the Pharaoh, and has never once adjusted the mission in response to the institution's reluctance to carry it. The mission outlasts every institution that tries to manage it. Give them the courage that Patrick had, not the courage of someone who is not afraid, but the courage of someone who is afraid and writes the letter anyway, who sends it into the rooms where it will cost something, who puts their name on it, who then, the very next morning before the response arrives, before they know whether anyone read it or set it down, goes back to the beach and keeps building. For the ones who have been on the receiving end of the Coroticus calculation, the ones whose suffering was weighed against someone else's standing and found, in that terrible institutional calculus, to be less important, let them feel what Patrick felt when he stood at the shore in the morning and looked at what had been done. Let them feel that the God of Patrick does not perform that calculation, that there is no relationship, no donor, no name, on no building that outweighs a person still wet from their baptism, that the letter was sent for them, that it still counts. Christ was on that beach before Patrick arrived. Christ was in the water before the soldiers. Christ was in the white clothes. Christ is in the gap where the institution will not go. That is where I want to be found, not in the room where the pastoral language is being shaped. On the beach, writing the letter, even if no one reads it. Even then, amen.